Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session. It's really great to have you here. We're just going to give it a minute or so to allow people to join the webinar today. It's really brilliant to be joined by Karma Nirvana for today's Insight Hour. I will kick off in just a moment. Welcome, everybody. I can see the numbers climbing up. So this is an IDA Insight Hour. I am Aisha Fordham, the Head of Membership and Engagement at IDA. IDA is a network of over 1,800 employer members now across the UK, and our mission is to equip employers to support all their employees who are impacted by domestic abuse and to share best practice with other employers. We endeavour to bring about constructive change, leading to a society where survivors thrive and where domestic abuse is not tolerated. So thank you all to those on the call who are part of our network and are supportive of our work. It's really great to have you as part of the network, and it enables us to be able to provide all of those resources and information across different employers. So today we're joined by Karma Nirvana. Karma Nirvana are a national organisation working to end honour-based abuse in the UK. We are pleased to be joined by Natasha Ratu, who is the Executive Director at Karma Nirvana, along with her colleagues Rachel Freeman, who is a trainer at the organisation, and Sondos Bauka, who is on the Survivor Ambassador panel. They're going to share more information about the organisation and what employers need to know about honour-based abuse. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the session, so please use the Q&A box to ask questions throughout. The audience also have access to the chat function, which will be managed by one of the IDA team. So please feel free to post in the chat. We encourage everybody to say hello, conversations, to tweet during the session as well, using the hashtag IDA Insight Hour. And as ever, please be mindful of the impact on others in what you choose to say on social media. The Insight Hour is being recorded to help us prepare for a summary for the key points. We will then be sharing this out in the newsletter, which is called the Tuesday Trio, which you can sign up for if you do not already. You can just ping us an email and let us know if you'd like to receive that. We appreciate that domestic abuse and honour-based abuse are challenging topics. Please feel free to step away from the webinar if you'd like a moment to just reset and to have that time to yourself. And now I'm going to hand over to Karma Nirvana for the session. Thank you so much. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Aisha. I just want to start by saying a huge thank you to IDA for giving us this platform to talk about honour-based abuse, an issue that is so hidden within our society, and having this platform to help educate employers about the things that they can be looking out for and think about the support that can be offered to people going through this in their organisation is such an incredible opportunity for us. So I just want to start by saying that. In terms of the objectives for the session today, we have three clear objectives. One, we want our audience to be able to understand essentially what honour-based abuse is. It's a loaded term. People don't quite understand it, or they have some ideas about what it could entail. For example, is it FGM? Is it forced marriage? And I've already thrown at you words that you may not understand, or you may, but often people do assume that honour-based abuse is a particular thing. So we're going to start by understanding what it is. And then we're also going to look at what are the indicators that you can be looking out for in the workplace. What are the potential triggers for honour-based abuse? And ending on what are the practical approaches that you as an employer can take to support your employees affected by honour-based abuse. Now, in order to make this a really rich and informative session, I'm joined by my two colleagues, two members of my team. We've got a fantastic panel guests. So we have Rachel, who is a former police officer who specialises in delivering the Karma Nirvana 3-day police training that is delivered up and down England and Wales. And we also have Sondos, who is a member of our Survivor Ambassador panel. She is a really welcome guest because she's here to share with you some of her own experiences relating to honor-based abuse, but also to talk to you about some of the work that she's been involved in with Karma Nirvana. So to share my screen, I'm going to go into our presentation that we have for you today. So just to give you a little bit of an understanding as to who Karma Nirvana are and what we do, let me see if I can move this along. Uh, there we go. So Karma Nirvana was founded 31 years ago by our founder Jasvinder Sangira. We deliver a national helpline. Our helpline is commissioned by the Home Office, and we support both men and women, which is quite unique because many national services that are situated in a VOG space, a violence against women and girls space, are dedicated to women. But we at Karma Nirvana support men too, recognizing that men are also affected by these issues. We do lots of training and awareness, this session being one example of that. And we've also been really instrumental in many campaigns to bring about change to this space. So examples of that are on this slide, where we've supported bringing in law to criminalise child marriage, to end forced marriage, to end virginity testing and hymenoplasty. And we currently have a live campaign that we'll talk a little bit about later on. But what we're essentially trying to create is a legal definition, because we still don't have a legal definition for what honor-based abuse is. So that's a little bit about us and what we do. And I just wanted to also vitally share with you our helpline number, because although our helpline is a resource for people affected by honor-based abuse, it's also a resource for you as an employer, as somebody who may be supporting somebody going through honor-based abuse. You might have questions that you want to ask, or a scenario that you want to run past, just to check that actually, you're giving the right and best support to the person that you are with. So it's an anonymous helpline. We can provide practical and emotional support. We can help people to find safe accommodation. We can do advocacy. We have lots of languages also available on our helpline. So please do take that number down, because this may be a helpful resource for you as an employer. Just going into our first question then of the session, just to jump right in, what is honor-based abuse and who does it impact? So this is a really, really huge question. It's a very big question that has quite a nuanced response to understand what it is. On the basis of our experience at Karma Nirvana, every person that goes through honor-based abuse has a very unique experience. However, the one common denominator that unites the experiences that people have is that the abuse that victims experience is perpetrated for this notion of wanting to uphold honor, for wanting to uphold these honor-related expectations. And a person who is going through honor-based abuse very often has expectations placed upon them. And these can be subjective, they can vary from person to person. It might be an expectation to live their life in a particular way, or an expectation as to who they will marry. There are lots of different expectations. But to explore this in a little bit more detail, I'm just going to bring in Rachel to share her thoughts from her experience as a police officer who has now retired, as to what honor-based abuse is and who it impacts. So over to you, Rachel.
Oh, thank you so much, Natasha. Good afternoon, everybody. And Natasha, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the panel today. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background in terms of how I came into looking at cases of honour-based abuse within the policing world. So I'm going to take you back to 2007, when I was involved in the first identified honour-based abuse case in my force at the time. And I was really shocked at the time to find that there was so little knowledge about these types of crimes. And I really struggled to find any guidance or any support. So at that point, I was really fortunate. I reached out to Karma Nirvana and I found the support and the education that I needed. At that time in the UK, there was a really small understanding of honour-based abuse within UK police forces. And that made me really want to improve the knowledge in my force so other colleagues could be supported, and but also more importantly, have the skills to be able to support the survivor that they were working with. So I'll just set the scene a little bit, if that's okay. So the first case was involving a young Iraqi girl. She was 17 years old. She was forced to marry overseas, and then she was brought to the UK by her older brothers and her husband. She was very isolated at the time. Her English was limited, but she was able to attend college where she was learning English, which was really supportive for her. Very sadly, what happened then was her husband created a situation that he then reported to her brothers, and that she had been seen to bring huge shame on her family. Her brothers then moved her to premises where they were living, which was on my policing area. She was so brave, and she managed to get out to speak to the police one day to report that her brothers, that she had overheard of them plotting to kill her because of the shame that she'd brought onto her family. Her husband had refused to allow her home, and she was basically being policed and being kept at home by her brothers, and was being really controlled very, very heavily by those people. So over the next 18 months, I supported her and saw the huge impact that this kind of behaviour had had on her life. She was so isolated, she was scared, and she was really lonely. She trusted no one apart from me and my supervisor, who would visit her and see her on the odd occasion. Her world had simply closed in, and she was basically being kept at home, watched constantly by her brothers. The people that really and truly should have been loving her and supporting her were the people that actually were posing the threat to her. She was only allowed to come to the police station on very, very rare occasions because her brothers were under the understanding that she had to come to the police to talk about her immigration status. She was really young, 17 years old, with her whole life in front of her, in a country that she could hardly speak any English, living with members of her family who had threatened or were plotting to kill her, and her father in Iraq making demands of her brothers to carry out their wishes. It was so heartbreaking. As a detective, your instinct is to want to arrest the perpetrator and seek justice through the criminal justice process. And yet in this case, I simply wouldn't be able to do that. She was absolutely adamant that she didn't want to support any prosecution or any police action. She just wanted me to keep her as safe as possible. Now, after those 18 months, she moved into another policing area, and I had to transfer the care to another police force. But that case really, really stuck with me, and that was why throughout the rest of my career, I wanted to then really pursue and follow any awareness and any training, reached out again to Karma Nirvana on many occasions, and was fortunate to be able to be trained within these areas of crime. That then made sure that I was able to write policies and guidance and deliver police training, and that's why I'm so thrilled now to be delivering training for Karma Nirvana.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think what Rachel really demonstrates is how you can have incredible people in organizations championing these issues. And often it is people like Rachel that are driving these issues that often get forgotten about in a broader umbrella of domestic abuse and a broader umbrella of VOG. So thank you, Rachel, for driving these issues as a police officer and actually beyond on the other side as well, and making those huge changes that you are bringing about. Thank you. I just now want to bring in Sondos. Sondos, could you just share some of your reflections on this question?
Thank you so much, Natasha, and I'd like to echo my absolute gratitude for being here and being able to share some of my experiences. It's so lovely listening to Rachel speak, particularly speaking from that experience in the police. I'm going to start my story kind of at the end, if that's okay. When I first approached the police for safeguarding advice, facing very significant threats to my life and to my young family's life, one of the first things that an officer said to me was, "We don't get a lot of this around here." And that's such a disheartening thing to hear. Somebody who you're approaching for support, somebody who presumably is there to protect you and give you that knowledge, essentially was dismissing my situation as something that was very rare. And I think that that really speaks to a much wider lack of awareness about this issue, which is why it's so brilliant that you're having this session today from the Employers Initiative. So in terms of setting the scene from my experience, one thing that I do want to share is that honor-based abuse, and we'll delve into this in a little while, is something that can be so deeply embedded that most people don't necessarily regard themselves as a victim of any kind of abuse because it's just their experience. And that was certainly the case for me. I was raised in a family, I'm a first generation migrant to the UK, and I was raised in a family where I knew throughout my entire life that there were very high expectations on my shoulders, but I wouldn't necessarily have had the language to label that as any kind of honor related dynamic. I've only really come to that awareness much, much later in life, following my experience. So just to share a few insights about what that looked like for me. When I was a very young baby, an attempt of FGM was made on me. FGM, if you don't know, is female genital mutilation. I came from a family, a culture where that was something that was practiced. Very thankfully, that was something that didn't actually happen. Somebody did to put a stop to it. But it's really just one example of the very extreme expectations and the coercive control that I was raised within. Now, as I got older, I learned that a way of surviving essentially was to have to live a bit of a double life. I had a persona that I presented to the outside world, but I had to withhold a lot of aspects of my own life and my experience from members of my family, and my immediate family were my direct perpetrators. Now, all of this came to a head when I was pregnant. So I was pregnant through the pandemic, twins to boot. So it was a bit of a difficult time. And one thing that we'll share later on when we talk about some of the triggers for honor-based abuse, we know that maternity and pregnancy can certainly be a trigger. And this is something that a lot of other people from the Survivor Ambassador panel have lived experience of. Now, this system of control really came to a head when I was pregnant, and it was revealed, and I had to reveal to my family that the way that I was going to be raising my children was not a way that they would necessarily approve of or that they would be expecting. And the consequence of that was that very significant threats to my life, to my husband's life, and to my very little baby's lives were made. There were also threats of kidnap, and that's really what prompted me to go to the police. I will pick up on another thread of what Rachel said, that a prosecution was not something that I either pursued or have pursued. That would not be appropriate in my situation. And I think that sometimes we put an onus on victims to pursue that route. But I essentially approached the police and other professionals for safeguarding advice. And really that resulted in me having to relocate with my family, essentially to go into hiding and to seek out the support of organisations like Karma Nirvana to essentially rebuild my life. Now, I will say that even though I lived through that really, really difficult experience, what I've learned as a consequence and been given the opportunity to do is to contribute to wider education campaigns, awareness. Karma Nirvana, I won't leave them alone. I'm always doing my best to take part in any opportunity they have. That's taken me to Parliament. I was part of a group who was able to present evidence to the Women and Equalities Committee last year. And most recently, I've been supporting Karma Nirvana in developing their training. And what I really am so passionate about is speaking out against the minimization of this kind of abuse. So many people dismiss this as just family issues, and it is so much more than that. And so many of us on the Survivor Ambassador panel are living proof that you can rebuild your life after it. So that's my experience in a nutshell.
Thank you, Sundas. And we're so grateful to have Sundas, to give through her experiences to actually try and make a difference for future generations and breaking that legacy of harm that actually exists where people like, Sundas in her position don't feel like they can change anything and they're part of this cycle. Yet what Sundas shows us is that actually you can break away. It's not easy, but it is possible. And we're enormously grateful to you for all that you've enabled us to do to put these issues on the map and really highlight how common honor-based abuse is happening. And just touching upon something you said, Sundas, about that reflection of a police officer saying to you that we don't get this quite often around here. That's really interesting because in the training that we deliver at Karma Nirvana, whenever we do training, we gauge how much people have dealt with honor-based abuse at the beginning. What is their confidence and how frequently have they come across this before? And you'll find that the majority of the room will say, never dealt with it, I don't think we deal with it, or it's not that common. Very similar to what Sandos has reiterated there. And then by the end of the training, I've got people queuing up to ask questions about these caseloads that they actually realize they are dealing with honor-based abuse, but they just haven't seen it before. They didn't recognize that actually the dynamics that we are there on the training to talk about are very much a reflection of the cases that they're dealing with. So just to kind of reflect on prevalence of honor-based abuse, we know that victims of honor-based abuse frequently report that they have multiple perpetrators, so they have more than one perpetrator. And in terms of who those perpetrators are, the majority are a partner or an ex-partner. And then that's followed by a close family relative that's either a male or a female, a mother or a father or a brother or a sister. To our national helpline, we've had 9,249 contacts, which translates into just shy of 3,000 cases. And again, we know that that is just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much underreporting of honor-based abuse because of these complex layers around shame and stigma and these additional barriers that victims of honor-based abuse will experience, as Rachel and Sandos have touched upon. We know that in terms of the workplace, we know that we've had in the last year 60 known cases reported where it's been an employer, somebody known at work, 7 referred by a colleague, a manager, and by a workplace counsellor. Also, to break down gender, this does disproportionately, as I've already referenced, impact women and girls, but we've dealt with 231 cases relating to men that have had these experiences too. So it's important to reflect that this does affect men and women. I wish we had more time to talk about the complexities of those different experiences. Perhaps we could do a longer session another time, but there's lots of information to highlight some of this data available on our website. And again, just when we're reflecting on demographics, there is a bit more information that's available on this slide. But as I've said, we've got lots of information available on our website. So what is honor-based abuse? Well, actually, what I can tell you is that we don't have a legal definition. We don't have a statutory definition for honor-based abuse. So everybody across the whole of the UK are using different understandings or different interpretations of what honor-based abuse is. We are proposing, as part of a campaign that we launched on International Women's Day of this year, for this to be used as a legal definition. And this has been endorsed by our Survivor Ambassador panel. Our Survivor Ambassador panel have been really involved in shaping what this definition looks like. But it's also been endorsed by 20 sector partners that work in the sector and that are challenging these issues on the front line. So we want people to recognise that it is an incident or a pattern of violence, threats of violence, intimidation, coercion, control, or abuse. Essentially the same sorts of abuse that we see within domestic abuse, being physical, sexual, economic. Spiritual, faith related is something that we've added, that we do see that quite often in cases of honor-based abuse. And it is motivated by a perpetrator's perception that the individual, so the victim in this situation, has shamed or may shame the perpetrator, the family, or the community for breaking perceived norms around what is acceptable behaviour. And that also includes victims who may actually be experiencing domestic abuse. So it's not motivated by a perception that they've done anything dishonourable, but the victim doesn't feel able to speak out because they're concerned about a perception that speaking out will cause shame. So it's also recognising that honour can also be a barrier to a victim accessing support. It's essential just to recognise that honour-based abuse is defined by systems of expectations. It's about control. And this is essentially what is at the heart of what we're talking about. So in order to move us on to our next question, we're going to think about how honour-based abuse can manifest in the workplace, and we're going to reflect upon what are the signs that we can be looking out for. And to draw us into this conversation, I just want to highlight a documentary that we were a big part of that came out in March of this year. And actually, the Push for Change campaign is based on this documentary. The whole campaign that we've established to create this legal definition is on the back of recognising the impact that it could have in cases like Fawzia. Fawzia Javid was a young pregnant woman. She was an intelligent, bright solicitor in employment law. She had, the world at her feet. There was nothing that she couldn't achieve if she put her mind to it. She was the only daughter to Yasmin and Mohammed Javid. And in 2021, she was murdered by her husband. And what's been really interesting in terms of trends since her story has been told and since the documentary was aired earlier this year is that we've had a real increase in employers contacting our helpline, recognizing that people like Fawzia can be victims of domestic abuse and honour-based abuse, because sadly there is this idea that people who work or people who are professional are somehow immune to domestic abuse or immune to honour-based abuse. And clearly we know that isn't the case. So I just wanted to highlight that Fawzia's case has been a catalyst for employers to recognise this, and this could be an asset for you to circulate information about Fawzia's story as it's documented through the Channel 4 documentary that we supported, and that can be found on the Channel 4 website and on our website too. So just kind of going back to that question about how honour-based abuse can manifest in the workplace, I just want to talk about firstly how it can be really difficult. I think we acknowledge it can be really difficult to recognise the signs with all the layers of shame and all the barriers that I've alluded to that make it difficult. But I'm just going to talk to and now bring in Rachel just to talk to this point about what could you be looking out for as an employer.
Thank you, Natasha. So in my experience of supporting many survivors, I'm aware that a number of survivors who are trying to lead a normal work life, actually work for them is an escape. It's part of their escapism, and they remain keen to carry on work. But employers may miss some of the signs that someone's experiencing honour-based abuse at home. And if they miss those signs, they won't be able to support appropriately. So some of the things that I've certainly seen in some of the survivors I've supported, it could be some unexplained repetitive absences. So colleagues may be putting in for annual leave requests, putting in for time off requests, maybe that wouldn't necessarily normally fit their routine or the pattern of annual leave that they've had maybe in the past. Any subtle changes in behaviour, maybe wanting to come into the office more rather than the working from home policy dictates, might be a sign that actually somebody's trying to get away from home. That's where mostly potentially the area of risk will be. So it might be that somebody actually wants to be in the office rather than being at home. It may be that they're not joining in on any social events because actually maybe they're being so controlled by the perpetrator or the perpetrators that actually joining in on those social events is simply not going to be possible. It could be that they have unexplained marks or bruises, which would demonstrate or be evidence of maybe some physical assaults taking place. Have they withdrawn from food? Because actually if somebody's really stressed and really under the pressure of being in that very, very controlling relationship, it's not uncommon to see somebody withdrawing from food and losing their appetite. Have they withdrawn from team events? So if you have a team, team building event quite regularly that your colleague has always been at, and all of a sudden now they're not there, that could again be a sign or a symptom that they're not able to take part in some of those other activities. Is there a change in performance? Are you is your colleague normally very, very productive, very, very successful, but actually now there's been a dip in that performance? That again could allude to maybe things being quite difficult. Actually, maybe they're staying in the office for really extended hours. They're the first one in before anybody else. They're the last to leave because simply they don't want to go home, because that's where the risk is and that's where the abuse is taking place. It could also be that they've applied for extended annual leave overseas, which again might come as a bit of a red flag in terms of the maybe just a change in behaviour and a change in a pattern. Hopefully that can help.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really, really helpful. I'm just going to bring in Sandos, and Sandos is also going to talk us through some of the triggers that you can look out for on the training that she has helped us pull together. So just let me know, Sandos, when you want me to put that screen on the PowerPoint. Oh, on mute, Sandos.
Sorry. Perhaps we can start with the triggers, and then I'll springboard from there into my own experience. So on this slide, we have a few examples of some of the possible honour-based abuse triggers. Now, when developing all of this training, it was so important to us that everything that we said was evidence-based. It's really important when you're dealing with an issue like this, because it is so often stereotyped and mislabeled and misrepresented. So all of the triggers that you can see have their source in helpline data. So our own honour-based abuse helpline, and essentially what individuals have told us have been the triggers for their own experience of abuse. And it's clearly not an exhaustive list, but we've just got some examples here. I just want to talk a few around them, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own experience. So one thing that you can see on the top right-hand side is a history of honour-based abuse. Now, this means that individuals might be experiencing certain aspects of abuse because it was sometimes labelled as the norm in their own community or in their own family. I'll come on later as to why mediation can be a really dangerous thing to do in cases of honour-based abuse, and sometimes that can seem counterintuitive. But one thing that we need to know is that these things very, very rarely happen in a vacuum. And when I talked about my own experience being one of this deeply embedded coercive control, that can obviously lead to individuals not necessarily identifying their experience as abusive because it's just the way that they've been raised. Another thing that's really important to highlight, and we've heard this from very many of our callers, is that just being female has been reported by callers to our helpline as the main trigger for their abuse. And clearly, and particularly in cases of men's experience, we know that sexuality can be a really important factor as well. At its heart, honour-based abuse is a patriarchal practice, but that doesn't mean that men don't have their own experiences. And I've noticed in the chat there are some questions and discussions around the role of gender, and I'll just signpost you to the Karma Nirvana website, where we do have a spotlight report that specifically deals with men's experience of honour-based abuse. So that might be helpful reading for people who want to pursue that further. But if I talk a little bit about my own experience, so at the time when my experience of honour-based abuse came to a head, I've already said that I was pregnant, and actually, for the most part, I was actually on maternity leave. Myself and my husband are both public sector workers, me as a teacher, him as a doctor, and I think that can often sometimes add an extra dynamic, which we'll talk about later in terms of steps that people can take or risks that people need to be aware of when talking or when dealing with issues of honour-based abuse. Now, in terms of what this can look like, Rachel's already touched on a lot of these in terms of what an individual might be reporting or how they may be behaving. I would say that it's worth knowing that for some people, because this is just their way of existing and you can very often get used to existing within that frame of mind, you might not necessarily notice a change in behaviour, but there might be behaviour that might give you cause for concern. So for instance, we know that relationships can really be the source of a lot of triggers. We can see on the screen here, we've got refusing marriage or divorce, but also, and this was certainly the case in Forzia's case that Natasha spoke about earlier, but being aware of what conversations are happening in the workplace, what is happening between colleagues, is somebody talking about any kind of coercion or pressure to marry, for instance, because we know that that can be a really significant trigger as well. I will also say that it's important to recognise that very often victims don't want that label of abuse, that there can be a sense that if you are disclosing or speaking to a professional or to a manager perhaps and saying, I'm concerned about what this particular person is doing to me, then you're almost labelled, or you might think of yourself as a perpetrator of abuse against your own community. And I think what doesn't help is the wider media rhetoric about certain people from certain backgrounds and certain communities. I think it's really important to recognise that any kind of behaviour that makes you concerned about something shouldn't be seen through a cultural lens, shouldn't be seen through a religious lens. Very often those things can justify or seen to minimise somebody's experience. And clearly I would direct you to the Karma Nirvana helpline. It's a resource for you. In terms of what this looked like for me, I would say that very, very intense monitoring at every single stage. So as a teacher, very often when I was in the classroom, I would be teaching all day. However, my phone was never far away from me. I was taking phone calls at every possible opportunity, always doing so behind closed doors. I've taken secret phone calls in pretty much every store cupboard in the school where I used to work. And I think this became something that people just came to expect. Oh, yes, she has to answer her phone, even if it doesn't seem as if it's an important issue. But because for me, monitoring and making sure that I was adhering to expectations was such an important characteristic of the abuse that I was experiencing. And that was before it reached that crisis point. So clearly, this is a complex issue, but it's important to realise that as managers, as professionals, you are not alone. Please reach out to individuals who can offer you that expert support, because it's very difficult.
Thank you, Sandas. And I think a really good example there. I mean, a lot of people do compare honor-based abuse to and being synonymous with coercive control, because you have these set of expectations that are expectations you're expected to uphold, and the control around that, making sure that these expectations are always met, that demand is met. That's a really useful example to give around how it can be noticed in the workplace. So thank you for sharing that. Just to move us on for time to our final question and to allow enough time for Q&A, we're now just going to reflect on how can employers support and what impact can that support have on somebody who's going through honor-based abuse. So Sandos, if I could just come to you first for this question.
No problem. So one thing that I will say, and I said it before, but I will reiterate it, that one of the things that we absolutely do not advise at Karma Nirvana is any kind of mediation with family members. In cases of honor-based abuse, it's 7 times more likely that somebody will be experiencing abuse from multiple perpetrators. So in essence, you never know if you are actually mediating with a perpetrator. So it can be really dangerous. I think that's relevant, obviously, in organizations. Very often we have members of multiple members of a family who might be working for the same organization. So even if it might seem tempting, it is something that we definitely don't recommend, and that would have been really, really dangerous in my particular situation. So when everything came to crisis point for me, and I keep saying that because actually my honor-based abuse lasted almost 30 years, but really when I'm talking about the point at which I had to take those significant steps to safeguard my family, I was on maternity leave, and I would say that my employers were absolutely excellent. One of the best things that they did throughout the entire process was keeping very regular communication, and I think that's perhaps extra difficult because I wasn't physically at work. I was on leave because of the pandemic as well. I wasn't at work for as long as other people might be if they were pregnant, and then going off on maternity leave. Essentially, I was shielding from home for a large proportion of my pregnancy. But in spite of that, there was very active and attentive taking of the issue very seriously. When we received threats to kill, both myself and my husband, I've already mentioned, are public sector workers, and one of the threats that was made was that our perpetrators would go to our places of work. As a public sector worker, it's very, very difficult to actually conceal aspects of yourself. So it was clear where I worked, where he worked. But in spite of that, there were really active steps that were taken by our organisations, and both of our employers actually liaised with the police in order to get a really clear understanding of what the safeguarding situation and what risks to mitigate against. Another thing that was really important throughout that process, because it was such a destabilizing and frightening time, was that with our consent, and with our consent, they actually shared information about the situation with very trusted colleagues. At no point was this framed under the lens of culture and religion. This can be such a damaging stereotype. And really that communication meant that we had a support network in place. There were people who I could refer to, I could speak about, knowing that they actually had a bit of a background awareness of the case, so I didn't have to rehash the same story when I was asking for somebody to take my twins out in the pram for half an hour so I could pack a suitcase that I could have by the front door if we had to disappear in the middle of the night. Later on, our employers didn't just leave us be. One thing that they did, which was really important, was providing mental health support. My organisation bought into an employee assist scheme, and as part of that, there was offer of counselling. But actually, speaking to me, my employer realised that I had an existing positive relationship with a counsellor, a therapist, and she saw out an exception in the policy so that I could actually have the funding to have additional sessions with this individual. And that flexibility was so welcome. And I would say that because of the way that they supported us at that very, very difficult time, it's meant that I've actually recently secured employment to go back to the same organisation of schools. And I actually start this week. I start on Thursday, so wish me luck. But I think that's really a testament to the way that that support was provided. And as part of that as well, they sought out support in terms of their own professional understanding around issues around honour-based abuse, and developing that for professional development for their wider teams. So the way that you deal with somebody and the way that you take their issues seriously, I think can really be crucial in your response, but also setting a precedent for other people to hopefully feel comfortable to approach in other situations like this.
Sandos, thank you so much for that. I think your employers have set a real clear benchmark for expectations and standards that we would hope would be replicated for anybody else who, may be affected by the issues. It's sad that we don't always see that happening, but I think you've given some really good, clear examples of what employers could be doing to make sure that people feel supported, and the impact being that actually your staff won't move on. Actually, you're going back to work. So that's phenomenal. Thank you. And Rachel, I know you're going to talk us through some of the practical and the environmental things that an organisation can do. So over to you.
Thanks, Natasha. There are so many activities employers can do. Some will be different to how maybe you would have supported your staff with some other concerns. So essentially, police and caseworkers will look at safety plans for survivors, and those safety plans will be bespoke to that person. They'll cover home environments, they'll cover if they're out and about in the public space, and they really should cover work as well. If you think that sometimes people could be at work for maybe 8, 10, maybe even longer hours in a day, that's a huge proportion of time that someone spends at work. And I think we need to be really creative with some of those safety plans as well. Tragically, victims have lost their lives in the workplace. So we just need to be really thinking about some creative work plans and some safety plans. So for example, if your colleague that you're supporting is currently working at home, as per your organisation's policy, that's maybe where the area of risk is. That's maybe where the perpetrator is. So therefore, maybe you can support them to maybe come back into the office, even if that is a letter or an email that they can then show to the family member or their partner to say that actually there's been a change in the working from home policy now. I've now got to go into the office maybe 3 days out of 5, maybe 4 days out of 5. Something that gives them some concrete evidence maybe that that policy has changed and they are actually needed back into the workplace, may give them that little bit of a buffer to make sure that they're feeling a bit safer when they're at work. Also think about the physical and the environmental security of the premises as well. So if there's a reception at the office or the office building, speak to the guards, tell the guards and the front desk staff who the perpetrators are and the kind of risks that they pose, maybe give photographs if you thought that that was appropriate. If your colleague is in a public-facing role, is it possible that they could move locations? If your company is quite large and is spread over several locations, actually, is it possible for somebody to literally move from the office to another location, so maybe where the perpetrators might not be able to locate your colleague? Can they change their hours rather than sticking to core hours, 8 to 4, 9 to 5? Maybe they might be able to do some other shift work, which again maybe would send the perpetrator in a different direction and therefore then maybe minimise or mitigate some of that risk as well. Now, sometimes colleagues can be at risk when they're transiting from their public transport or from their car to the office environment. So maybe we might need to think about, is there parking close to the office that actually could be secured for a short time, could be reserved for your colleague to be parking in, where it's lit, where it's under cameras potentially, or actually maybe the security guard, are they able to escort your colleague from the office to their car and vice versa, just to give that reassurance as well, just again to mitigate some of that risk. Lots of companies will use social media, will use their website to highlight their team members, but actually maybe we want to restrict the showing of the photograph of the colleague who is at risk, because again, it's going to highlight to the perpetrator that they are working for that company. Human resources will have access to lots of data, lots of information, personal information. And in cases like this, we really would look to keep the circle of knowledge very, very tight. And if there are opportunities to cloak some of that information, to sort of hide some of that information to maybe not all access, then that probably would be recommended, just so we can keep some real confidentiality, because that's really, really key to be able to get the confidence of our survivor, to make sure that they don't think that everyone in the company is talking about what they're going through. And of course, lots of companies have amazing support within their workplace. So it's really important to support those on to maybe more therapeutic style support for your colleague. And as Sonda has already said, please no attempt to ever mediate or contact family members or spouses in cases like these.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. Some really solid, really important points for employers to be taking away. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. All of our details are on this last slide here, and it takes us nicely to the Q&A. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and come back into the main room, bring us together.
Thank you so much, Natasha and Sondos and Rachel as well for that amazing presentation. Just for our attendees, I'm Kristen Tua, I'm the IDA comms lead, and I'm just going to be facilitating the Q&A alongside Natasha, because I think that was a really great overview just to make people aware of just how prevalent honor-based abuse is, and also some of the stereotypes and misconceptions that people have about how it works, who it affects, and also just realizing the role that they can play as individuals in a workplace to support and help that individual. We've got some questions in the Q&A box. Everyone, please feel free to submit more. We've got some as well. We've got one anonymous question that is, how does coercive control come into this? For example, where someone is saying that they don't want to look to press charges, how does the police balance that request against coercive control impacting a person's consent?
Rachel, do you want to come in, as it's a police kind of question and I can add some bits to that?
Yeah, of course, Natasha, thank you. It is a really good question. I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think there is real clarity. If somebody is deciding not to support a prosecution, then obviously as a police officer, you're going to try to unravel some of the reasons as to why somebody doesn't want to support a prosecution. Ultimately, it is their choice. Now, of course, we do have the route which we know as evidence-led prosecution. So that will be where we will seek to bring a criminal justice outcome without the support of the survivor. That would be with the consent of the Crown Prosecution Service, and the evidence really has to be quite strong before we can go down the route of an evidence-led prosecution. There's a big but that comes with that, because if you're doing that, you're going against the wishes of the survivor. And we want to be able to make sure that the survivor is as supported as possible. That's physically, that's emotionally as well. So as a police organisation, if we were to make the decision to follow the route of an evidence-led prosecution, we may then really lose the confidence of the survivor, and the survivor may then, backtrack, maybe stop communicating, and we may not then be able to really try and manage the risk as best as possible for that survivor. So it's on balance a very, very difficult decision to make. Ultimately, our safeguarding responsibilities probably should override any wish then to carry forward an evidence-led prosecution.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's really helpful. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on this, or if you concur.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Rachel has said there, because I think essentially if you don't have the trust of the person and they're disengaging, they're going to be at more risk. And actually, if you're evidence-led and your evidence is what the victim is saying, they're likely to retract, and you're not going to have that person supporting, and actually they're then off the radar. And we know that for victims of honour-based abuse, that they're more likely to mistrust professionals, particularly where professionals, they have cautionary tales of people within the community that have gone to get help and they've ended up going back because they haven't been properly supported. And then when that is validated by their own experience of going out to professional, they're going to be less likely to come back again and get help. So they're more trapped. So essentially it's safeguarding first. It's making sure that we're keeping them as safe as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean pursuing a prosecution.
I think that's really helpful. And I think that employers dealing with all kinds of domestic abuse cases need to grapple with this to a certain extent. But as you pointed out, Rachel, I think the safeguarding consideration must always come first, even though employers should always strive to be victim survivor led in their response to a domestic abuse case. We've got several questions in the chat about how to approach a colleague or an employee that we think might be experiencing honour-based abuse. And I would just like to add a little bit onto that in light of what you said about misconceptions and stereotypes, because I think that, if people are afraid that they're being seen as, perhaps culturally insensitive, or that they're afraid to start that conversation because they don't want to offend anyone and they don't want to make those mistakes, how can they kind of factor that in when they start conversations about honour-based abuse with an individual in the workplace?
Sandos, do you want to come in? I had a feeling you might.
Itching to come in. No, I think it's a really, really important question, and it's a difficult one, and I don't have a straightforward answer to it. But what I will say, and we talk about this a lot on the training, is that cultural sensitivity should not trump your duty to safeguard. And actually, when I was developing the updated training resources, I asked our helpline team, what's the number one thing that you would like me to include in the training? And time and time again, I got different versions of don't be afraid of being labelled as racist, don't be afraid of this issue of cultural insensitivity. And I will preface that by saying I can't tell you not to be scared of something, but I think what I would say is that if you can't be brave, and one of our survivors actually said this when I did some work at stakeholder consultation, is if you can't be brave in a situation of somebody who's experiencing abuse, when can you be brave? So what I will say is that contact the helpline, because they can be best placed in terms of what those initial steps can be. They can support you perhaps in having those conversations. There are lots of resources at Karma Nirvana, some of them in development, which might be able to support with that as well. And I would say that you might be aware of the cycle of change, which is kind of that idea, and it's often used in the kind of the context of addiction, but we also use it on our training. And you never know where somebody is in that cycle. It might be that one conversation. We have a kind of a schedule of questions, kind of probing questions that you can ask that we also draw on in our training. It might be that one question or that one conversation that you have that might lead somebody to actually recognize for themselves that what is happening to them on their experience actually isn't right. It might not happen straight away, but what you shouldn't do is saying, I've done this training, I attended the Employers Initiative Insight on Honour-Based Abuse, that's what's happening to you, because you aren't going to build rapport and trust. But what you can do is reach out to the helpline. They can give you support in framing those conversations and also managing what that risk looks like, and draw on that, hopefully that trusting relationship that you already have with your employee or with your colleague, to initiate that process. But ultimately, victims and survivors need to come to that conclusion themselves. At Karma Nirvana, we don't tell people what to do, but what we do is we try and empower people to recognize and lead to that kind of that place of self-determination.
Thank you so much, Sondas. I couldn't agree more with what you said about being brave, and that's something that we encourage all of our members to do, is to be able to have those difficult conversations. And actually, that as an employer, the fact that you create that space for people to have the conversations should be a green flag to all of your employees, to signal that this is an issue that you care about in the workplace, and that when someone is ready to have those conversations, you will be ready for it. So even if they don't disclose to you in that moment, you might have laid the groundwork for them to disclose to you at a later point, which is also so important. I'm going to move, because we're getting quite a lot of questions now, so I'm going to move on to the next one, which is, are there any actions employers can take to address potential perpetrators of honor-based abuse in the workplace? Any advice?
Really interesting question, because there are risks that also come with that. I think it's about making sure that whatever approach you do take, it's a safe approach. So Sondas and Rachel have both spoken about not mediating. So if it's in the context of supporting a person who has come forward, we wouldn't be suggesting that you go to a perpetrator and you sought to address that behavior in that way, because that can increase the risk for the victim, but also it could be quite inflammatory for that person trying to address the perpetrator's behavior. With that said, however, what I think is really important for employees to do is to ensure that, these sorts of behaviors that are harmful, that are about power and control, showing that as an organization that this isn't condoned, that this isn't acceptable, showing where your beliefs and values as an organization are, showing that you're anti these practices, I think is a really helpful way to really show where you as an organization stand on these issues without putting yourself in direct risk by confronting a perpetrator. So you just have to be very mindful and careful. And I would say that there are some professions, to give one example, and this is something we hear quite often through the helpline. So GPs, for example, and practices where sometimes things do need to be challenged within your organization that you're working within. So we've had GPs who have shared some of the beliefs and values of perpetrators and have communicated that to victims, which obviously needs to be addressed and it needs to be reported. So there may be things that you need to do as part of a process if you have an employee or a member of staff that is showing behaviors that are harmful. So I think it's making sure that you're doing the right thing as well if you do see in your workplace that you have perpetrators in that space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natasha. That's really helpful. Rachel or Sondas, would you like to add anything to that, or have to move on?
I think Natasha's covered everything that I would want to say on that point.
Absolutely, yeah, me too. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. I'll keep going through with a couple more questions. We've got a couple of minutes left of the session before we need to wrap up. So I'm just going to finish on this last one, which is, do you recommend that employers have a standalone policy around honor-based abuse rather than kind of tagging it under a general domestic abuse response? If so, are there any tips or guides or resources that you have, or any templates that could help people implement that?
I'm going to let any of the other panelists come in, given that I spoke last.
I mean, what I will say, and I'm always going to do this, I'm going to plug our training. Natasha, I'm sure, will speak about what specific resources are available at Karma Nirvana, and I know that Anoop from Karma Nirvana is on the call as well. He might be able to support. But we do deliver training to multi-agency professionals, so anybody who might be interested in that for their organisation. A lot of that training is drawing on some of the resources that we've talked about today, but also talking about what the specific steps might be, delving into specific case studies, examples of best practice and things to kind of do's and don'ts. And our, the feedback from that is really strong. So I would say that can be a really helpful resource. Personally, and I'm sure Natasha will say what resources are available, I would say that there are some protocols and procedures that are quite specific and perhaps unique to honour-based abuse. So I would be very much pro a specific policy, because, for instance, the principle of not mediating or not working in partnership with other people around the victim, that very much flies in the face of a lot of the other safeguarding procedures that certainly in my own employment as a teacher, we would be talking about working together, and actually that wouldn't be appropriate with honour-based abuse.
Yeah, and I totally echo what Sondos has just said. Should be a separate policy in my view. The nuances, as Natasha alluded to at the beginning of this session, need to be really focused on, and HBA, honour-based abuse, it's not all domestic abuse related. So I think two separate standalone policies would reflect the specific needs.
Yeah. No, that's really, really helpful. Thank you both. And I think one of the things that really stuck with me is that multiple perpetrator aspect, whereas in a regular, if you will, domestic abuse case, you might really rely on familial networks, friends and family to help support the victim survivor, and that's really not the case, it seems, in a lot of honor-based abuse cases. So that's super, super helpful to take forward. We've come to the end of the session. I just wanted to thank our guest speakers, Natasha, Rachel, and Sondos, for sharing your knowledge, and also Sondos for sharing your lived experience. We're incredibly grateful to Karma Nirvana for the work that you do, both frontline support to victims and for the wider advocacy work that you do to raise awareness and affect political change around this issue. And I hope that everyone takes away from this webinar why honour-based abuse is a workplace issue and how you as employers and colleagues can support people who may be affected. And just a little logistic summary from our side, we're going to be sharing a summary of today's session with links to some of the key resources that Karma Nirvana have mentioned. These are going to be circulated in our Tuesday Trio newsletters. So as Aisha mentioned initially, if you haven't already signed up to that, please go to the IDA website and sign up so you receive it. And our next Insight Hour is going to be on Tuesday, the 14th of January next year, where we're going to be looking at domestic abuse and an employer's legal commitments, because there are some legislative changes that have happened in the UK recently, and we're going to be sharing this link with you shortly. So please keep an eye out both for the Tuesday Trio and on our socials, where we're going to be sharing this link. And we're also very interested to hear from people. If you want to pop in the chat, if there are any other topics that you would like us to cover in an Insight Hour, please send us a message. And so, yeah, we just want to wrap up with saying thank you so much for joining us. We hope that everyone will have a fun, festive, and safe holiday period. And we very much look forward to seeing you at the next IDA Insight Hour in the new year. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.